The gavel fell like thunder in a church. That was the first thing people remembered about that morning. A single sound splitting the quiet like a rifle crack through Sunday hymns. And there, at the front of the near-empty courtroom in Shallow Creek, Nebraska, sat Judge Merrick Dalton, a man whose reputation preceded him like the long shadow of a dying oak tree. He was known for his steel-gray suits, his longer-than-the-law lectures, and his patience for nothing but power. The boy standing in front of him, however, looked like wind might carry him off. He wore a too-thin jacket for early spring, fingers clasped in front of him like he was holding something sacred, perhaps hope. His name was Elijah Ray, 17, brown-skinned, soft-eyed, and silent. Not out of fear, but out of something older, something deeper, the kind of silence you inherit. There were no reporters, no family, no waiting public, just a bailiff, a sleepy clerk, and a public defender who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Judge Dalton had seen boys like Elijah before, or thought he had. Theft, obstruction, resisting arrest, the judge recited, barely looking up. Caught near Officer Kendrick's home after dark, wearing dark clothing. He tapped the file once, like a punctuation mark. Typical, he muttered. Elijah didn't respond. His silence twisted something in the judge's gut. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was worse. It was stillness. A stillness that didn't ask for permission to exist. The public defender, a young woman named Claire Wren, cleared her throat. Your Honor, my client maintains that he was merely out for a run. There is no forensic evidence linking him to the vehicle. Nor save it, Dalton said, cutting her off. You think I don't know what loitering looks like? What casing a house looks like? Claire opened her mouth again, but Elijah moved first. He stepped forward, eyes calm, and said the two words that would change everything. You're dismissed. The clerk gasped. The bailiff shifted. Dalton blinked. Excuse me. Elijah reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded paper, and held it high. Claire, unsure, moved to intercept, but the clerk stepped forward first. She took the paper. Read it. Her eyes widened. Dalton stood now. What is this? An emergency suspension, the clerk whispered. Signed by the State Judicial Conduct Board this morning. Effective immediately. Dalton laughed, but there was no humor in it. This is a trick. A stunt. No, sir, Elijah replied. It's a reckoning. And for a long time, no one spoke. Not even the gavel king. Outside, the sky was the kind of blue that only comes after storms. And in the hallway beyond those heavy oak courtroom doors, a crowd was gathering. But for now, inside the courtroom, silence reigned. And Elijah Ray, son of a mail carrier and grandson of a man who marched in Selma, stood tall in the place where boys like him were taught to kneel. He had not come to plead. He had come to deliver. The courthouse had always looked like a place of permanence. Stone pillars, heavy oak doors, and that bell tower that hadn't rung in 30 years. But that morning, as dawn washed the windows in gold, it seemed hollow as stage after the actors have left, waiting for a new script. Outside, the town moved on. Buses hissed, school children clutched their books, and the scent of bread rose from the corner bakery. Life had learned to move past the courthouse, but inside something was shifting. Elijah sat alone in the interview room. No cuffs, no glass between him and the air, but he felt bound all the same. The morning had not belonged to him, and neither did the story that now swirled around his name. That name, Elijah Paul Thompson, was no longer just his. It was in newsprint on cell phone screens, whispered in diner booths. He could still hear Judge Henlon's voice, rattling inside him like a sermon spoken through clenched teeth. But it was the silence after the silence when Lisa Grant had stepped forward that rang loudest. Across the street, Harold Thompson stood at the window of the Eyes on Justice office. His nephew had pulled off the impossible, but Harold knew this wasn't a triumph yet. It was a spark. And sparks could either light candles or wildfires. He turned from the window and walked back into the conference room where Lisa sat, flipping through case files with the patience of someone who'd seen too much. Her badge rested beside her tea, and her eyes moved like a woman who could recite laws and lullabies in the same breath. How many? Harold asked, voice low. Lisa looked up. 19 confirmed so far. All black. All teenagers. Similar charges. He sighed and rubbed his face. He had a type. Lisa nodded. He had a method. And a pattern. They both looked at the manila folder between them, Elijah's folder. Not just his case, but the evidence, the recordings, the plan. It wasn't only bravery. It was strategy. The kind born from knowing what it meant to be seen as less. Back at the courthouse, Elijah was finally released into Harold's waiting arms. Reporters shouted, microphones thrust forward, but Elijah said nothing. Not because he had no words, but because he was saving them. They drove in silence, past the library, the old feed store, and into the part of town where porches mattered more than gates, where the scent of lavender soap and fried catfish lingered in the air. It was where Elijah had grown up, his feet in Georgia red clay, his mind in books that smelled like history and heartbreak. That evening, the living room filled. Aunties with foil-covered dishes, cousins perched on armrests, neighbors who didn't ask what happened, they just hugged. Elijah sat still through it all, until his grandmother took his hand. Her skin was papery soft, her eyes clouded but fierce. You didn't just walk into that courtroom, she whispered. You walked into all of ours. My father, my brother, all the ones who never made it out. He nodded. A tear slipped down, but he didn't wipe it. You made them look up, she said. You made them see. That night, Elijah dreamed of trees, great oaks swaying under southern stars. And in the wind, he heard names. Names of boys with records they didn't earn. Names buried in paperwork and shame. The next morning, Harold and Lisa briefed the team. Their goal was clear. File a civil motion to challenge Hanlon's past rulings, but also to launch a review panel. Real reform. Lisa looked at Elijah. You ready to speak publicly? Elijah exhaled. They need to know what he said. What he saw when he looked at me. Lisa nodded. Then let's start writing it down. For days, Elijah recounted every detail. The way Hanlon's lip curled. The gavel slam that felt personal. The disbelief when the paper was read aloud. His voice never shook. Not once. And in a small school gym, with folding chairs and a borrowed microphone, Elijah finally spoke to the community. Not about himself, but about what it meant to walk into a system rigged to fold people like him into its walls. They never expected me to speak, he said. They expected me to bow. But I come from a line of people who know how to kneel without breaking. Applause. Not loud, but true. Not fireworks. A fire slowly catching. But outside, storm clouds gathered. Hanlon was speaking now on TV, in op-eds, in legal circles, claiming bias, political games, witch hunts. Harold turned off the television. He's not just trying to save himself. He's trying to rewrite the ending. Elijah stood. Then we don't let him. In the days that followed, the real war began not in courtrooms, but in back offices, in evidence boxes, in whispered testimonies. A teacher remembered a student broke in after a harsh sentence. A retired bailiff confessed to hearing Hanlon's private remarks. A clerk found a stack of altered files. Bit by bit, the house Hanlon built out of names and silence began to fall apart. And Elijah? He wasn't watching from the sidelines. He was building something too. Something louder than a verdict. They came for Harold just after midnight. A soft knock. A flash of light. Then steel hands and whispered rights. He didn't fight it. Just looked back once at the coat rack where his brother's army jacket still hung after all these years frayed. Sun-bleached. Proud. The agent said it was obstruction. Said it was tampering. Said he'd gone too far. Elijah was still awake, sitting on the porch steps with a notepad in his lap and a cold mug of chamomile tea beside him, when the car pulled away with his uncle inside. He didn't cry, didn't shout, but something in him broke, not the part that feared the system. That had cracked long ago. No, this was deeper. The part that still hoped for fairness. Lisa was on the phone before dawn. They're scared, she said. You rattled them. And now they're reaching. She paced her tiny kitchen, the one with the yellowed linoleum and the photo of her mother above the stove. That woman had fought school boards, police chiefs, and voting laws. Lisa came from the same cloth. We get Harold out, she told Elijah. Then we go bigger. By noon, Eyes on Justice was flooded. Volunteers, lawyers, reporters, old activists dusted off their files. Young interns ran coffee and typed as fast as they could. Elijah moved through the noise like a quiet center of gravity, always listening. And somewhere in that buzz, he met Miriam. She was a law student from Detroit. Short curls and sharp words, wearing a pin that read, "My roots remember." She looked at Elijah like she already knew him. Maybe she did. Not him exactly, but boys like him. They stayed up late that night, reading transcripts, Hanlon's rulings, sentencing reports, the subtle patterns others missed. Miriam caught a rhythm, a repetition of phrases used only in cases involving black youth. "Look," she said, tapping the screen. "He keeps using lack of remorse in cases with identical plea deals to white kids who got half the sentence." Elijah leaned in. "It's like he expected guilt, even where there was none." "Exactly," Miriam whispered. "He wrote their story before they opened their mouths. They built a matrix case by case, year by year. And as the chart filled, the truth became unignorable." Elijah's voice began to reach beyond the county. A podcast in Atlanta, an op-ed in The Root, a clip shared by Ava DuVernay. People began sending their stories, parents, former students, even retired law enforcement. One envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a photocopy of a journal, Hanlon's. The handwriting matched confirmed documents. The entries were short, cold. One read, "Another fatherless one today. No surprise." Elijah stared at it until the words blurred. Then he whispered, "We're going to bury this man in truth." Harold was released 3 days later on bond. When he walked back into the house, Elijah didn't hug him at first. He just placed a journal page in his uncle's hand. And Harold, the old soldier, the once young protester, sat down at the table and cried for the first time in years. They filed a federal complaint. The Justice Department opened a preliminary inquiry. The state bar launched an ethics review. And Hanlon, for the first time in decades, felt the ground shift beneath him. But it wasn't enough. Because the court system doesn't bleed easily. It bruises slow. It forgets quick. So Elijah kept speaking. He went to schools, to churches, to town halls. Not with fire, with quiet conviction. His voice didn't rise, it deepened. And in that calm, people listened. One night, as he stepped off the church pulpit in Montgomery, a woman in her 80s took his hand. "My son," she said, "they sentenced him without ever looking at him. But you're making them look." Elijah nodded. "That's all I want." "Then don't stop. Even when they start smiling to your face, that's when they're most dangerous." And she was right. Because the real pushback came not with fists, but with praise. Invitations to panels, awards, committees. "They want to make you safe," Harold warned. "Palatable. The good kind of angry." Elijah refused. He turned down TV deals, declined the profile in time. Instead, he asked for records, demanded audits, filed more requests. And still, he dreamed of trees, the oaks again. And now, the wind carried more names. Names he hadn't heard before. Names he wasn't going to forget. The courthouse marble looked the same. Cold, polished, deceptively clean. But the people walking through it now were not the same. Every footstep carried memory, and every glance bore the weight of unfinished stories. Judge Hanlon had been suspended pending investigation. The gavel that once struck like thunder now sat untouched in a glass case. But ghosts don't wait for justice, they hover, lean close, whisper into the ears of those who try to forget. Elijah had moved into the back office at Eyes on Justice. No longer just a name in a folder, he was part of the team. He learned quickly how to file motions, organize statements, listen without breaking. There was power in silence, but greater power in learning how to speak when it mattered. Lisa guided him like an older sister might, stern when needed, gentle when it counted. "You're not here because of what you suffered," she said one night, sorting through files. "You're here because you saw a crack and dared to look inside." Across town, resistance bloomed like weeds between sidewalk cracks. Some called Elijah a liar, an opportunist. Old money whispered about that boy trying to tear down tradition. Anonymous letters arrived at the office. One had ashes in it. Another had a clipping of Elijah's face burned at the edges. Harold kept them all in a drawer. "If they're scared," he said, "then we're getting close." The review panel hearings began in mid-July. Sweltering heat clung to shirts and turned tempers short. The courthouse was public now, every session live streamed, every transcript published. And in front of the panel sat not just Hanlon's record, but the stories buried in it. A mother spoke about her son, sentenced to 5 years for stealing school supplies. A teacher recalled how her brightest student came back from juvenile detention a shadow. An officer, now retired, admitted that Hanlon gave longer sentences to the ones who didn't look like him. Elijah listened to them all. Then, on the third day, he took the stand. No lawyer beside him. No notes. Just memory. I remember the way he looked at me, Elijah said. Not like I'd done something wrong, but like I already was. He spoke of the medal, the silence after, the way his own dignity had been weighed and dismissed. I brought evidence because I knew my word alone wouldn't be enough. I didn't want revenge. I wanted proof. And when he finished, the room did not applaud. It just sat with him, breathing, heavy. After the session, an old man approached Elijah outside. Skin like worn leather, eyes like quiet rain. My brother stood in front of that same man in 1973, he said. Didn't stand a chance. But you, he swallowed hard. You cracked it open. Enough light got through. Weeks passed. The hearings unearthed over 60 questionable rulings. Several were vacated. More were under appeal. Hanlon's defenders grew quieter. His legacy, once spotless marble, now showed deep and permanent fractures. But the work wasn't over. Lisa, Elijah, and Harold pushed for a community oversight board, one with teeth, not just ceremony. They held town halls, met with council members, even brought in legal scholars from nearby cities. One night, Elijah returned home late. His grandmother sat in her robe, radio humming softly beside her. You tired? She asked. He nodded. Feels like I'm fighting a mountain. She smiled. Mountains don't move easy, but rivers they cut right through. That night, Elijah wrote his first op-ed. It wasn't angry. It was clear. It spoke of the pain of being unheard and the power of being seen. The next morning, it ran on the front page. The headline read, "Beneath the marble, we still bleed." And under it, Elijah Paul Thompson, community advocate, not victim, not defendant, advocate. And the town began to see him differently, not as a symbol, but as a river. The final hearing was set for a Thursday, the kind of day that felt like it couldn't make up its mind, clouds threatening rain, but sunlight punching through in places, stubborn and uninvited. The courthouse loomed like a relic, but that morning, it buzzed. Not with fear, with anticipation. They came early, the families of those 19 teenagers, mothers in their Sunday dresses, fathers with worn hands and folded arms, siblings clutching envelopes of photographs and certificates no one had cared about until now. They came because Elijah had spoken, and once truth is heard, it echoes. Elijah arrived with Harold and Lisa. No tie this time, just a black shirt, pressed but open at the collar, like a preacher of a new kind of gospel, one stitched from records and bruised memories. As they stepped through the courthouse doors, the weight of the past didn't vanish, but it shifted. Judge Hanlon sat on the bench again, but he was no longer untouchable. The press watched. The State Review Board sat to one side, and behind Elijah, rows of pews were filled with the eyes of those who had once been invisible. Lisa rose to speak, calm, clear, relentless. This is not about vengeance. It is about correction, about acknowledging the machinery that operated not by justice, but by bias masked as law. The gallery leaned in. Evidence was presented. Charts, files, testimony. Then Elijah took the stand. Not as a defendant, but as a witness to what should never have been. He spoke of how it felt to be measured by the color of his skin instead of the content of his actions. He named every teenager Hanlon had sentenced with disproportionate punishment. And their names, Elijah said, are not lost. Their stories are not gone. They are here, in this room, in this city, in the breath of every mother who told her son to be extra careful, not because he was wrong, but because the world was. A hush fell. Even Hanlon's hand stilled. At the end of the day, the ruling came. Judge Hanlon would be disbarred, pending criminal investigation. His rulings in the 19 cases would be overturned and reopened, and a commission would be established to examine sentencing disparities statewide. Cheers didn't erupt. Instead, tears fell, soft and slow, the kind that had waited too long to be believed. Outside, the clouds had finally broken. Rain drizzled light across the courthouse steps as people embraced. Elijah stepped aside, watching them, not claiming the moment, just part of it. His grandmother's hand found his again. "You done good, baby," she said, voice a whisper. He looked at the sky. "We're not done yet." And he was right. Because reform doesn't end in a courtroom. It continues in classrooms, in council meetings, in every place someone dares to ask why things are the way they are and imagines how they could be different. The courthouse bell, silent for decades, rang the next morning. No one knew who pulled the rope, but it rang just once. And it was enough. Elijah walked the steps alone that time. Not to make a statement, just to listen. He stood beneath the marble arch and closed his eyes. In the wind, the name still whispered, but now, the world was listening.